Hi everyone, before we get started, could you all do me a huge favor and come a little bit closer to the stage? Please, I would appreciate it. Thank you. I sound fine? Okay. Yeah, thank you. Thanks. Sweet. Thank you. Alrighty. So I think we're gonna go ahead and get started. How's everyone doing this morning? Good. Good. Okay. My name is Norma Lira Perez, and I'm here to talk about the work and personal experiences of Mexican immigrant women in Wyoming. When translated, as you can see my title, when translated, no nos queda de otra means we have no other choice. The word doméstica is actually drawn in inspiration from Pierrette Hondagnu Sotelo, who wrote a book on Latina immigrants working in LA. And so a little bit about this project. This project was started last summer shortly after being admitted into the McNair Scholars Program here at the University of Wyoming. Dr. Lilia Soto is my mentor, and she helped me throughout this project. She teaches for both the Chicano Studies program and American Studies department. So a little bit of what I'm going to talk about today. This is my overview, and I'll touch a little bit on background, purpose, and context. With my research, and then I'll go into a little bit of my project description, which will include methods, literature, and review, with findings and analysis towards the end. And then I'll end with acknowledgements, and we'll save a little bit of time at the end for questions and answers. So, as a child, I was raised by immigrant parents. I witnessed and felt firsthand labor struggles that manifested in my mother and father's lives. My mother has worked in the domestic sphere for her entire life, while my father only knew hard labor as a construction worker. Even before arriving to the United States, my parents were limited in employment opportunities. I had always wondered how they were able to juggle a family of 5 children with multiple jobs at once. Time spent away from home was based largely on the fact that my mother had to care for someone else's home and sometimes children. Labor as a societal structure creates divisions and inequalities that ultimately affect working class families due to low wage earnings. Moreover, the most common industrial subdivisions for immigrant women include domestic, garment, and housekeeping work. It is crucial to examine the different lived and worked experiences found within immigrant communities. This is especially important in Mexican immigrant communities in rural areas or non-gateway states such as Wyoming, Nebraska, Colorado, Utah, Idaho, as these are the fastest growing in the United States. My project attempts to give voice to the silent experiences of Mexican immigrant women who provide home care services to wealthy residents and visitors of Jackson Hole, Wyoming. The core of this analysis is based on 12 interviews that were conducted in the summer of 2015. In this project, I use an intersectional approach that includes labor, gender, and immigration. In larger discussions of these concepts, Mexican immigrant women are often placed at the margins and are seldom given the chance to tell their stories. Preliminary findings reveal how the women view their positions and treatments in the workplace. Hourly wages, hours worked per week, past and current employers, and cost of living is quantified. I argue that Mexican immigrant women actively create and engage in survival strategies in order to circumnavigate the workplace and their personal lives. The narratives and personal thoughts of Mexican immigrant women provide a unique viewpoint that add to our knowledge of labor structures and growing immigrant communities. A little bit about context. So in the year 2013, the small town of Jackson reported to have over 10,000 inhabitants, where 33% were immigrants, and most of which are Mexican and Latino. From the year 2010 to 2015, a 5% increase in the Latino community added to the Latino population, which continues to grow today. Though most Mexican immigrants have traditionally settled in large numbers in the Southwest, we are now seeing the growth of Mexican immigrant communities in non-traditional or non-gateway states. The emergence of non-gateway states challenges spatial patterns of migration of Mexican immigrants that arrived and settled to rural areas now. The rise of population of Mexican immigrants is the backbone of the tourist town of Jackson, Wyoming, where there is a high demand of labor to maintain local businesses and households during winter and summer seasons. As the population rises, divisions of demographic and economic strata become more and more evident. As one particular article reported in 2014, there are now more younger, poorer Latino residents and older, wealthier white residents. While rent increases, there's little to no wage increase in wages. These living and economic situations have had major effects on people that live and commute to work in Jackson, Wyoming. For example, the Idaho towns over the Great Teton Pass, such as Driggs, Victor, where many Mexican immigrant communities have settled, are also facing rent increases. In combination, the rent upsurges and economic divisions are impacting the working class that is predominantly Mexican and Latino. As I had mentioned at the beginning of my project, this attempts to give voice to the silence experiences that many Mexican immigrant women undergo while catering to the affluent town of Jackson. Particular areas of interest include how women view their workplace and their position and their treatment. This quantifies also for wage earnings, amount of work hours in each, work hours each week, and their perceptions on these variables. I also asked about present employers of the participants. All but one reported having some sort of benefits from these employers. I also inquired about cost of living and house in relation to their labor earnings. Most women that were interviewed currently live and work in the town of Jackson. The dates of arrival range anywhere from early 1990s up to the last decade or so. Many of these women have formed transnational or border ties between Mexico and the US. This means they have created social networks between these two social worlds, of which includes having family in both locations. 11 out of the 12 participants were born in Mexico. The sample is made up of women over the age of 18, the youngest being 19 and the oldest being 52. All participants had past experience in domestic work while living in the US. 11 out of the 12 women are mothers where 8 out of the 11 women are single mothers. One participant, who I will refer to as Celia, was born in the US to a Mexican immigrant family. Celia strongly identifies with the Mexican immigrant community as well as some of their economic plights that undocumented immigrants face. In regard to documented or undocumented status, many women revealed their status during either their interviews or in personal side conversations. 3 women out of the 12 have some form of legal documentation, one being a DACA student, and the other one being a resident, and the other one being US born. There is a pervasive sense of fear attached to the topic of undocumented status, which have affected the amount of information that women were willing to share during their interviews. A little bit about my methodology here. The data was collected through a series of interviews in form of case studies, all of which were heavily based on personal narratives and participant observation. A total of 12 interviews were completed, though 14 were originally scheduled. I had set up interviews with 2 additional women, but was rejected due to the fact that these women feared legal consequences in regard to their status as undocumented immigrants. The interviewees were asked if they knew of other Mexican immigrant women who were employed as domestic workers. Therefore, much of the data was collected in form of snowball sampling. An additional form of methodology was participant observation. I was able to accompany 3 out of the 12 women to their workplace for half or full days. Participant observation included a day's worth of circadian duties at their workplace. In order to ensure the safety and secure identification of the interviewees, I assigned pseudonyms to every participant. All but one interviews was audio taped. One participant refused to be recorded. This participant, whom I will refer to as Gertrude, informed me that she felt a little uneasy and intimidated with the mere thought of being audio taped. Additional participants reported a similar sentiment after the interviews, and once the interviews were done, they ranged from anywhere from 30 to 60 minutes. Many of the interviews took place in either private homes or the public space of their choice. 2 interviews were conducted via Skype or via video chat. 10 out of the 12 women 10 out of the 12 interviews were recorded in Spanish, while 2 were in English. The main sections in the interviews that were covered were personal information, wages, labor, life and demographics in Jackson. The interview questions had an open-ended structure. And a little bit about some of the literature that I used for this, for my analysis. Douglas Massey's model of migration supports the idea of labor structure and its demand for economic stimulation. Though migration can be traced back to the early 1500s, it is the industrial period that lasted from 1800 until about 1925, where we see the highest amounts of immigration waves in the United States. As an independent nation, the United States expanded its economy, which provided labor opportunities for immigrants. Ever since this first massive wave of immigration, the U.S. implemented several immigration law and policies that created restrictions on who would be able to enter the country. This included immigrants coming from south of the border. At the micro level of migration, neoclassical economics are considered to understand and tease out specific reasons behind migration. Massey describes the push-pull effect as a structural action made when a low-wage country pushes migrants out of the country, while high-wage countries in need of cheap labor pull in migrant workers into their country. Consequently, massive migration patterns occur over prolonged periods of time. The juxtaposed macro level of migration focuses more on segmented labor markets, where developed industrial societies like the US have a high economic demand for labor. Immigrants coming from low-wage countries are vacuumed into the inexpensive labor demand. The pull factors occur due to structural inflation, duality of labor and capital, ethnic enclaves, and permanent demand for workers. Rural areas are unique in that they provide industrial towns and cities with unwavering stream of low-wage workers. The social capital theory is based on social implications, connections, and jobs that are waiting for migrants in the new country. Though there are limitations to these approaches. International migration is affected by agents of a community who take on a specific role that fit within their skill level and labor contributions. And so now I'll talk a little bit about this. Domestic work is slowly becoming a global phenomenon. After the civil rights movement in the United States, many women and racial minority groups were granted the social upward mobility, which allowed individuals to enter different labor sectors. However, home care remains in the hands of women of color. Today, much of this population is mostly made up of Latina and Mexican immigrants. The increased economic disparities result in higher demands to fill in the void of domestic labor. Educational levels also become a determinant of labor and skill levels. Many Latina and Mexican immigrant women often leave their mother countries in search of a better life and economic condition. For many, migration was one of the few options that helped avoid further repercussion of Mexico's economy crisis during the 1980s. A substantial amount of these women are undocumented and are thus limited to paid domestic work, including housekeeping. Though through transnational ties, many Latina and Mexican immigrant women created social networks and soon learned about opportunities to work in the US, such as labor as factories, hotels, and private homes. A differentiation must be made between what is known to be domestic work and employment. Since there is a lot of social stigma attached to domestic work, some refrain from labeling it as real employment. This comes from both the employee and the employer. A private setting, such as a home, creates a natural association to caring for a home and children. Homeowners are also hesitant to identify themselves as employers in relation to their workers because they do not fully comprehend domestic work as a labor structure. This creates a specific employee-employer relationship based on minimal contact, which in turn perpetuates inequality and maltreatment of workers. Subsequently, paid domestic work becomes a major issue by not being considered as employment. This is amalgamated by the subordination of race and immigrant status on the women who care for private homes. It is also crucial to address the traditional master-servant relationship rooted in domestic work. This depicts labor as a structure that is permanently interwoven with power-driven economic, social, and psychological relations. Oh, we'll stay there, actually. Kimberly Crenshaw and many other women of color were cognizant of the ways in which race, sex, and class affected their lives. As a result of their experiences, Crenshaw coined the term intersectionality. I use the intersectionality paradigm here to critically analyze the women's lives. This theoretical framework supports the idea that social identities such as race, class, gender cannot be separated from one another across contextual lines. This means that the intersections of identity become multiple sites of oppression. At these intersections, as these intersections create different sites of marginalization, we must realize that they also allow one or more social identities to be heightened depending on time and space. That is, historical context and place greatly impact the experiences of women of color. The experiences of Mexican immigrant women add to the conversation of women of color in the United States, where their experiences are mainly shaped by their gender, race, and immigrant status. Many of the women interviewed expressed that they had left their mother country in order to pursue a better life and economic situation. One participant, who I will refer to as Julia, stated that migrating to the US was one of the few options she had to escape poverty. The women wanted better opportunities for their families and also for themselves. 5 women arrived before the age of 18, constituting them as childhood arrivals. The decision to migrate was not in their hands and was a decision made by family members that had previously traveled north. All women described having social connections prior to their migration to the US, or to Jackson. These experiences are supported by the social capital theory that I touched on earlier of migration within that context. Those women were able to work their interpersonal ties and allowed connection with individuals who had settled in the town of Jackson and to gain and consequently had access to resources and job opportunities. When a micro and macro level lens is used, the push-pull factors deemed to simplify a much more nuanced experience of immigrants in a new country, especially the journeys of immigrant women. Previously, I had mentioned that all women interviewed had past experience cleaning homes. And participated in different areas of domestic work. Out of the 12 women, 10 reported cleaning homes full-time, while 2 participants, Ingrid and Larissa, work full-time at bakery shops. However, both of these individuals did clean homes as a part-time job on the side. There was only one participant, Karina, who worked in a hotel part-time and also cleaned homes when given the opportunity. Wages of current employers for the women who reported working at a hotel was $14 an hour. The 2 participants employed by bakery shops received an hourly wage of $10 and $14.66. The 7 women who cleaned homes had a wage that varied anywhere from $20 to $35 an hour. Leticia, who earned the highest amount of earnings per hour, posited that she freely enforced her hourly wage. She also kept reinforcing the fact that she was her own employer. In other words, she directly interacted with homeowners. 3 women out of the 12 worked with a third party that served as a mediator between the homeowner and the domestic workers, so that would mean a company, a cleaning company. Though most women did work for either private homeowners or for a third party, limited interaction was across the board. There were several incidents that women described when asked about treatment in the workplace. General feelings of depersonalization were expressed by the women. Leticia, who earns the highest wage, expressed feelings of being seen as a labor object or un objeto de trabajo, when there was little to no physical interactions with the homeowners. Another participant, Julia, reported several high-stress interactions, or what we refer to as blow-ups, with her middleman employer. These interactions included verbal and emotional abuse from the employer onto the workers. Since Julia has been living in Jackson since the early 90s, she encountered several moments like these in the workplace. There were accounts that strictly dealt with conflicts between white women workers and Mexican immigrant workers. At the core of these conflicts, Julia, like the rest of the immigrant women that I interviewed, demanded better treatment and a distribution of workload. Due to language barriers, miscommunication with both coworkers and employer is more common than not. The combination The combination of personal narratives and theoretical discussion devises important and unique perspectives within immigrant communities in the United States. This project aims to present a detailed account of the immigrant waves and labor divisions that have shaped the town of Jackson. The work experiences of domestic workers remain under-examined. While there is an increase in the Latino demographic in both Wyoming and in the nation, it is important to document and record these lives and experiences of these hidden voices. These case studies reveal the multi-layered experiences that many Mexican immigrant women undergo throughout their lives working in the so-called equality state. And I'd just like to give a quick thanks to my mother and also the interviewees who were able to share their stories with me. And again, thanking Dr. Soto for helping me throughout this process. And then my McNair, I call them my McNair mothers, Zaki and Susan, and then also my transcribers, Jenny Lira and Bianca Infante de la Cruz. Yeah. So yes, now it's time for Q&A.
If you have a question, I'm going to make you hold this. Who was that? Here you go.
Hi,
Hi.
my name is Kira, and I live in Jackson.
Mm-hmm.
And I totally, this is obviously something I don't see every day because I pass for white for the most part. But I'm curious, in my personal experience, Jackson is unique, well, not necessarily unique, but it's interesting how everybody you talk to, it seems like everybody is fighting to work and live there. And, you know, it's such a struggle there. It's pretty hardcore in terms of housing and whatnot.
Right.
And I also know it's a pretty hostile place for immigrants. I was curious, though, because it is such like a hardcore place when it comes to work and housing and whatnot, do you think that makes it sort of like a level playing field because everybody is going at it, or do you think that immigrants still have a disadvantage?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I think a couple things come to mind for me, right? Looking at labor as a structure, it is very much racialized. And especially in places like Wyoming where labor is limited, housing is limited. I mean, recently they just told all of the Virginians, so the Virginian apartments in Jackson, they're very famous, have been there for a really long time. They're completely kicking everyone out within the next month. So we're dealing with things like that, but we need to think about how these spaces and these labor structures are racialized, right? Because a lot of those laborers or these workers are Mexican immigrants or are people of color, right? So we need to think about how and why they're being racialized, right? And historically, not just today. I mean, we're talking about history, like the United States history, and then in combination with just the history of Jackson and the arrival of immigrants in the early 1980s and how that has basically shaped the town today. So I think that's, I don't know if I answered your question, but that's what comes to mind is how these spaces are being racialized and then even gendered in some ways. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for sharing your knowledge with us. I really appreciate it. Also, my question is, how do you navigate your current life being college educated and then like re-entering spaces where maybe people aren't college educated, and how do you just navigate, you know, that intersection, and how has that come up for you, if you're willing to share?
Yeah, of course. Thank you for the question. I think this is something I'm very cognizant of. Going to college was a huge thing. I'm first generation. So none of my parents passed middle school level education. And that, in and of itself, just growing up in that position has really shaped who I am right now and what I'm doing now. In terms of entering spaces where education levels are different, you know, these women are the ones who are wise, they're strong, and they are very strategic in the way they navigate their lives. So I look to them, really, for any type of guidance, and this includes my mother. They have learned life lessons that I haven't, and I probably won't until later, so I'm really humble about it, and I try to respect women whatever their experiences are, whatever they have to offer. And I always try to be open-minded about that, because I don't know everything. And I feel like the more I learn, the less I know. So it's really a conflict within myself, but I think staying connected to these communities and getting to know women on personal levels is really important to me. And I didn't mention this earlier, I mentioned this a little bit, but I really see those relationships really navigating my space within that, so, yeah.
Hi. Thanks a lot for this talk. I really enjoyed it. I also have lived in Jackson for 10 years, and I had a question for you. In terms of the workforce being racialized, I have a lot of friends who are both white and Hispanic who work the same jobs. Mm-hmm. I have a lot of white friends who are nannies, and I personally have worked in a lot of labor jobs myself. Mm-hmm. Also housekeepers, also working in kitchens. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the people you interviewed, how they felt their experience was different than the white workers doing the same jobs.
Yeah, I mean, most of the time, it was really hard to get these women to talk about race relations. Like, it's not easy. It's a sensitive topic as it is. But for these women, it was really hard because some of them were very new to the setting, so they didn't really know how just things were going on in Jackson in terms of labor, in terms of just living there. But the women that were here for the longest time really have learned over the past couple of years how to navigate these different worlds, right? Because we're talking about most of these women, all of their first languages are Spanish. So we really, like, these experiences are multi-layered, as I said. Within their interactions with white women, I think that most of it is really, again, like I said earlier, the distribution of labor. So for example, some of the women were saying that, they'd clean an entire house pretty much by themselves, and they'd be with a white woman, female counterpart, who wouldn't do as much work, or who would kind of just go here and there, maybe do this. And in terms of employer, the employer would often pay them even more, and would pay the white women more. And so this was really interesting because, now the women are asking, like, what is it about me that defines my wage and defines my amount of work? And knowing that most of these women are very, very good at what they do. They're very good, and they take very much pride in that. And so their interactions within the workplace, really, they come up with ways to self-preserve. So whatever that means, whether that means biting your tongue and not saying anything, whether that means letting something slide. And this happens on a daily basis in different forms, right? So really a lot of it, they in terms of relations between the women that I interviewed and white women, or even Mexican men immigrants, is that, they try to shield themselves in a way that they can get their work done, get money, because that's what they need. And so they really have become resilient in different ways. There's a question up here.
Hi, Norma.
Hi.
Thank you for sharing. But I do have a question. How do you think, obviously you're talking about these intersections of power structures and then systems of oppression that are obviously preventing these women from, speaking up or even moving forward within different power structures that they're a part of. How do you think that you, being a college-educated individual who's obviously connected to these women and to these communities, can help or assist in dismantling these systems of oppression that they're facing and really trying to create systems of change for them to eventually succeed as women of color within these working situations? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thanks. I think this is a question I'm still struggling with. Even as I present this this topic, it's been really hard for me to determine that. I think one of the ways, again, building those relationships is what I mentioned earlier. I think that's really important to start off with. But also even, in some way, I think the women that I interviewed gained some sort of agency after I interviewed them, knowing that someone was interested in their struggles and interested in showing that to whoever. And I let them know that I was going to present this to different groups of people, and it was probably going to be presented within a course of a year. So I think for me, the biggest thing is really to look at need, like what types of need do these women, what do they need in terms of moving forward, and what does that look like? The first thing that really comes to mind is maybe, you know, there's only so much I can do, but in terms of organizations that are in Jackson, really push for that language options, right? So in terms of being bilingual and how that even could enhance their interactions with employers, because I didn't mention this earlier, but the woman who is getting paid the most, she actually is fluent in English, and so her interactions are very different from the women who just recently arrived and have no idea what's going on in terms of English. So I think learning English is really utile, but I also think that the employers have to have the same type of mentality. I think that knowing that somebody's first language isn't English and respecting that, and then also wanting to communicate them maybe in their own native language, I think that's respectful, and that's a medium that could be reached. Another thing that I think about is maybe, because a lot of these women want to get educated. Like, a lot of these women are like, you know, if I had the funds, if I had the means, like, I would go study, but I obviously can't because I'm a mother. I work. I do all these things, so they don't have those opportunities. So maybe even providing, communal opportunities in terms of educating women, and then also tying that back into their personal lives, so how it affects them, and really pushing for these women and providing those opportunities. But again, I think a lot of it has to do with resources, and right now it feels like there are a lack of resources in terms of how to help these immigrant women specifically, given their situations. Yeah.
Is there a community, I mean, how do these women come over from their countries and know how to get the help that they need? Is there like an unspoken situation set up where they can reach out to these people that are already settled?
Right, so I did mention this a little bit, is this transborder, transnational tie, right, that these women have to their mother countries. So what's really interesting about Jackson is that most of the Mexican immigrant population comes from one specific state in Mexico. So this is what I mean by transnational, is that how do these transnational communities start? So from what I know specifically in Jackson, there was a gentleman who was actually recruited through the Bracero program, which is one of the immigrant policies that I mentioned earlier at the law level. Is the Bracero program recruited specifically agricultural workers. And so this kind of set up for transnational communities, because now these workers are being distributed in rural areas and finding different types of economic opportunities, and then their stream of migration increases. So really just looking at how that ties into the women today is really interesting, because like I said, the small town in this, it's called Tlaxcala, San Simeon Chipetzinco, Tlaxcala, and that's where most of the Mexican immigrants in Jackson are from today. And what really happens is, you know, we have social media, we have all of these mediums of communication that really make it easier for these women to communicate. And then even like talking to my mom, she knows tons of people, and I mean, Jackson's small, right? And so word of mouth, you know, I like some immigrant women suggesting where to work and referring employers to employees and things like that. So it's very much reliant on this idea of social capital and having those connections and really using them. And I think we're up. We're good, yeah.